Hello, everyone, and welcome to Dr. Deep State. We have our friend today, Will Tucker, and we are going to be talking about politics, neocons, and Norwegians, those pesky Norwegians, and ultimately, we're going to ask the question, when Christ becomes hate speech. Will Tucker in the house. How you doing, Will?
Doing very well. Freshly off my 40th birthday, so feeling kind of elderly over here, but otherwise doing great.
Excellent. I was going to say, if you didn't, Will just had his 40th birthday, which before I even get going, I had some friends contact me. I put my personal link, and I want to say hi, all you that reached out, especially Ohio, Indiana, some great reach outs. And as long as I'm doing this, I've never mentioned this before. If you're still around, Jersey Daniel, if you're still around, I want to say a howdy to you. And of course, my European Daniel friend, I want to say a big howdy from Texas to you, Daniel. Got a couple Daniel connections. They actually know each other. So one has been a friend of the channel since 2017. In fact, he was into some heavy Catholic theology and introduced me to great ideas that I used in Seeing Through the Singularity, like the concept that Protestants don't talk about too much, but the idea of God transcending his creation. That really opened my mind up to being able to write this Singularity. If anybody hasn't read the Singularity, we will be talking about the theme from that, which reappears again in Pursuit of the Metaverse, which is the enmity of the two seeds. That's what I used to juxtapose as a thesis for the Singularity, and I believe it's just as apt in the times we're living in and figuring out who is who. And so again, I said that In Pursuit of the Metaverse is about coming with a sword and cutting things in two. And that's, I think, being able to identify the enmity is very central to looking at the political landscape. Now, we here on Dr. Deep State have not done too much of this, Biden, Hillary, Trump. I've let my feelings about Trump be known from the very beginning, and I might do that again. And so we don't usually get into that regular fanfare, but we might get into it a little bit today. So we've been doing some back and forth, but Will and I this week, just generally, we're on pretty much the same page. And how I'm going to begin this, I think it's probably good that Will and I just kind of disclose a little bit about our backgrounds, where we're coming from. So we're going to do a little back and forth of who we are. Then we're going to say the paradigm that we're working from, which is the spectacle. And the term we coined in the book is the empire of spectacle. So I think it's important that we realize we can talk about our individual nation states and some of the dramatic tensions going on, but we're all living part of this phenomenon called the spectacle. And I think that's an important paradigm when we're talking about politics domestically. And then we'll talk a little bit about neocons and conservatives and the leaven entering the church by way of traditionalism. Of course, we're new to the church, and we're going to be like Eminem, picking off other white rappers. So we're going to be punching at our level here when we get to that. And we're going to be doing that, it appears, for time to come. Because again, I'm not a big exposed guy, and I'm certainly, if I'm doing exposed videos, not going to sit there and take millions of clips of the person with weird expressions on their face. But we are apparently going to have to start going after some leaven inside of the church and inside of the traditional movement. So, Will, do you want to start talking a little bit about everybody probably assumes you're a Southern boy. The reality, he's like an hour from, Ohio. So, he's South, but culturally, and there's complexities about American history in the South. For example, you don't have to go into this, Will, but Will's great grandparents were actually part of the Union, even though they were in Kentucky. So there's some interesting phenomenon there. But Will, your family are kind of Fox News watching kind of regular folks, right?
Yeah, exactly, as you'd expect. I guess I'm technically a first generation college grad. And I grew up in a pretty semi-rural area, kind of like right on the edge, similar to how Kentucky is situated to the Midwest, like kind of on the edge of a minor city. So I had kind of my foot in, town life and city life, sort of Jason Aldean world, with the county fair and that kind of thing, to keep it relevant. But yeah, whenever we want to throw a little flavor on it, we'll say that we're Appalachian. Kentucky's an Appalachian state rather than a Southern or Midwestern, give us a little bit of distinction. But yeah, so I've mentioned on here before my background in the art world and, going to art school. So I had a heavy dose of kind of liberal political programming and conditioning early on, but being from, you're conditioned to unlearn your conservative background and kind of go to war with your parents' generation a little bit. But as I grew up, I started to realize, like cultural identity is the key to making it in the art world. So like how to kind of flex on this, kind of odd geographical background that I have. So Wendell Berry became a big influence for me. So I was identified, as like I guess not necessarily a liberal, but more on the left. And so like as I began to form my political positions, I've started thinking along the lines of like this agrarian anarchism is the way I would think of it, as along the lines of like what Wendell Berry lays out, or James C. Scott, Jacques Ellul, E.P. Thompson, Lewis Mumford, some of these Luddite thinkers from the mid-century who were criticizing, E.P. Thompson's from the 19th century, or I'm sorry, the early 20th century. But, these critics of technological society and mass media culture and the spectacle, and that posited, in contradiction to it, this agrarian back to the land kind of mythos. But that fuses really well with the environmental movement. So at that time, like, the mid-aughts, there's this kind of internal contradiction within the environmental movement between Luddites and sort of technocrats, like those seeking technological solutions and those seeking kind of a back to the land. So that was very much where I was kind of approaching, my political awareness at that time, that my world was shattered when I started looking into 9/11 research and conspiracy stuff. About actually almost 10 years ago to the day, 2013 is when I kind of had my conspiracy awakening, and that just blew my paradigm totally out of the water.
Good. For me, I grew up in the upper Midwest, in a red household, flame. It was a red house, or red. We were red. I grew up Lutheran. I went to college, and I was just kind of there. I just absorbed it. I wasn't too political. I've never been into voting. I did it a few times. I just never got into it that much. So what, red? I, kind of like you go, I spent most of my adult life in the big city, and you kind of want to be kind of open-minded and check out these funky courses. And I also did a lot of this art, funky stuff too. And I was at Harvard, I think, when I realized that there's some programming going on, and sometimes they weren't interested in truth. They had an agenda, but I had no vocabulary for it. So I was confused about that for a number of years. In the late 90s, I think I started about that time picking up on Pat Buchanan. I believe the journal was called New American, but the idea of a paleo conservatives, and the idea of how the Frankfurt School had come into the education. It's saying everything, but not dropping their Norwegian name, right? So you start kind of seeing the patterns there we're building. Who are these neocons? And then you start seeing how they kind of operate from the left and the right, and how they transition pretty comfortably back and forth. So as far as this concept goes, I've even said it to my students this week. I think it was Eric Erickson. He's a developmental psychologist. I think his original name is Eric Homburg. And he had this idea that we sort of, our socialization, our formation, we have a certain environment, family, neighborhood, school, church, and then we kind of branch out, and then we end up kind of coming back to our comfort zone that we were socialized in. And so that's been very much my situation, is that even though I was in the depths of these, insanely liberal people, but not like nowadays TikTok insane necessarily back then, but close. And so I would have been the conservative guy that just left. I just kept my mouth shut and just wanted to get through the programs, especially when I was in New York City. But I would have been the conservative person. I would have just thought of myself as middle of the road, but I was increasingly looking at this kind of paleo. How did these neocons take over the movement? And then you start seeing, wait a minute, these neocon policies of dominating the world, monopolizing all the resources appear on both the left and the right. And if people can kind of, sometimes I realize, pick up on that at some level, but they get sucked back into the show. And I think that's why we need to kind of introduce the model of the spectacle. But yeah, for me, that would be about where I'm at. I was up in Vermont, got a little crunchy for a couple of years there. I voted for Obama once. That was it in my life. I thought, as a reaction, maybe he's not going to be a neocon or something different would happen. And, in short order, you see that the bureaucracy is the same from administration to administration. Something I've called before the Washington Consensus since the 1930s. You fundamentally get the same policies over time. And in fact, the policies associated with the red or blue, it's usually passed by the opposite side. I'm talking about American politics here, but the process is similar throughout Western democracies. So, I became very critical. I had my conversion experience 10 years ago, and I became very critical of democracy, but I didn't have a language or a way to thinking about it. So when I had my conversion into Catholicism, and communicating with Will, we read a lot of similar books, like Archbishop Lefebvre's book. They have uncrowned him, a critique of liberalism, and it just hit home. Everything started to make sense. So when you have the paradigm of the kingship of Christ, and so that's what I promote. It's not, I don't think it's going to appear on the next platform in the election, but that is truth to me. So when we've steered, they have uncrowned him from altar and throne. Does that mean I'm a monarchist in the whole boat? I just think this is fundamentally true. I'm going off on this. I've looked back, as Aristotle and Plato did 2,000 years ago. They looked back over 1,000 years and looked at these constitutions, and there are certain typologies. A king is, I think, the best form of government. A bad king is very bad. All the way through political theology, democracy is the worst form of government. It's so easily manipulated. To the extent that it works somewhat and it's somewhat believable, it ends in tyranny. And I believe there's a controlled demolition to make people partially dislike their current governments, but because they need democracy to consent what they're doing. It has to have just like the preparation for Synod of Synodality. It has to appear to be the listening church, and then they do what they want to do to kind of create that legitimacy. So I think democracy is just one grand hoax. But yeah, so we've been getting to thinkers like that. Of course, my book ends with, Father Dennis Fahey really got into D.C. Schindler and those kind of integralists. And that's just truly what I believe. That is that's the proper ordering of the world that was central to Christian civilization. Christian civilization simply wouldn't have been able to be handed down for 1,500 years, 2,000 years without that structure. I do believe when Christ gave us a church, told us when we're in trouble, lean on the tradition, and he said, go out and baptize all nations. That was institutionally to do that through the unity of the church. So that was the Grand Commission. Now, the fact of where we're at right now and the paradox, we can talk about that in a moment. But that's kind of my background, and that's where I'm at right now. I believe the world's in a funny spot right now. This kind of thing called democracy is bottoming out. But I do believe that I'll use a word I've never used before, the globalist. They want to keep that structure of democracy. It's got to appear legitimized by the people. Yeah, I can throw it back to you. Well, what I'd like to do right now is just develop the paradigm for people that have never heard of it, the spectacle. Could you start us out a little bit, Will, with a guide bar and what the spectacle's about?
Sure, I'll do my best here. Guy Debord is a French thinker. What's the word? Post-structuralist, mid-century, Marxist, neo-Marxist thinker who was critiquing sort of the parameters of capitalist society, production and consumption, and how that shapes our ability to even think within society and to be able to imagine reality. So the spectacle itself replaces reality. It becomes the central referent in which all expression, all social functioning relates back to. So there can be no independent reality outside the spectacle. Well, I'm kind of conflating Jean Baudrillard and Guy Debord's. Guy Debord had a way of these kind of like anarchist interventions. He was involved with an art movement called the Situationists International, in which they would, if anyone's familiar with contemporary art, the happening movement of the 1960s, a lot of performance art comes out of this kind of situationist thinking in which you confront normal modes of behavior and interacting with social space in order to trigger these kind of irrational, erratic, contradictory types of actions that, think about Yoko Ono's artwork, for instance, like her early artwork. The Fluxus movement is another kind of outgrowth of Debord's thinking in the Situationists, but it's a way of kind of attacking bourgeois expectations of social functionality. So, but the way we're using the spectacle, the term that Doug uses in Pursuit of the Metaverse is the empire of the spectacle, kind of as a way of utilizing St. Augustine's city of God, city of man contradiction, where the spectacle itself overlaps, eclipses, the social kingship of Christ, and the social forum. The spectacle becomes a social forum that all modes relate to. So, yeah, I mean, you can really see this, when we talk about politics, the dialectic, the controlled dialectic that keeps everyone glued to the TV, glued to the cable news channels, glued to Twitter. What's the new news item today? That's the way the spectacle work. It attunes the central nervous system so that it can only think within a certain parameter that's been controlled electronically from above.
Yep, nice. I'll do a little bit. Hey, hit us up when I hit you on the other side. Remind me, why don't you do a little bit about the medium is the message. But yeah, the spectacle, one way of thinking about it is we're still stuck from our textbooks and our television with this paradigm of the nation state and the sovereignty within the nation, and looking to that as the powers that be are our weekend at Bernie's president that we have. So I think people should be more kind of waking up that maybe he's not running the show. So the spectacle, here's the thing, it's biopolitically and mimetically, and that's where you get into the Giardian mimetics of it all, but we don't need to go that far right now. But the biopolitics, I can unpack that in a moment. But the idea here centrally, we're controlled from within, but we're still working with a paradigm where we're looking at power from outside. But it's very subtle. This is this Foucaultian notion that we're trapped inside this consumption loop. I was even reading this old quote from Huxley this morning in 1931. He said, democracy will be the perfect framework of our new prison. People won't even know it's going to be a prison of consumption. And that's why these French post-structuralists thinkers have something to say. So we're using that model. They want to crush the transcendent frame and we'll get into that. But that frame is very helpful to understand how we are controlled from within by ourselves through our patterns of consumption, but primarily it includes the image, which the book is all about unpacking that idea of the image and the juxtaposition of two images, the metaphysical and the real, compared to the artificial image. But we're controlled by the image and the virtual reality. So we're controlled without realizing exactly what Huxley was talking about. This is what they're building, a cage that we don't want to leave. From a Christian perspective, that's very dangerous, because you might think of when you don't even realize sometimes that your notion of God is trapped in the immanent frame. And that's a whole nother conversation. But in short, the spectacle is helpful because once you kind of get that and see that, you can see it. Now, the conclusion of the book by Hart and Negre, who I use throughout my book, it's called Empire from 2000, Harvard University Press. It's a powerful book, but I ultimately at the end critique the book. But the reason it is, here's the takeaway. So these guys are probably the loudest voice of neo-Marxists, and they're very powerful paradigm that's now entered IR discourse, international relations discourse. And their ideas they see in the year 2000, they saw coming, is that the direction of history that they would call evolutionary direction of history is moving toward the merger of man and machine, cyborgism. Their solution as neo-Marxists is to crush. They don't believe in the transcendent. Those are all false gods. That's all the fog of God. They want to crush it down. And their solution is for us to merge with machines and become the cyborgs that we want to be. So whether you take the powers that be, the Neocons and Norwegians, they're forcing us on this especially. So their opposition would essentially have the same solution. So you start to kind of get that the only vantage point that you can have, in our opinion, is the reality that was introduced through Christian civilization. So that's a little bit about the spectacle. And as Will suggested, anecdotally speaking, you can ask yourself in your own, we'll use the word awake, right? There's degrees of this. And I ask you, the viewer, when you look around, you can pretty much, man for man, woman for woman, regardless of a person's IQ, the more propaganda, textbooks, television, Netflix, and the worst of them all, the nightly news as presented on the lamestream, the more they consume that, the more they're hooked. And it's just man for man. I've noticed that, especially over the last 10 years and longer. Well, oh yeah, we can't get into everything. We're not going to get into the egregore, but I do a very systematic breakdown of the egregore, and I think at one point we call it the egregore is the medium is the egregore. But yeah, talk a bit about Marshall McLuhan.
Yeah, Marshall McLuhan is a very influential media theorist, mid-century, who coined the term "the medium is the message," which is kind of a tricky concept to get your mind around, but I think it makes a lot of sense when you think about the spectacle, the political dialectic, and how the messaging is not meant to. It's not about abortion. It's not about the rights of man. It's about the system itself perpetuating itself and keeping you trapped within its parameters so that you can't think outside of it. It becomes a central nervous system. And so that's the metaphor that McLuhan uses. And so it makes even more sense if you think about it in contrast to an integralist, or as like a kind of inversion or parasite from the integralist mystical body of Christ, as the model of Christendom. So I'm going to read this quote here from Marshall McLuhan's introduction from Understanding Media. So it says, after 3,000 years of explosion by means of fragmentary and mechanical technologies, the Western world is imploding. During the mechanical ages, we had extended our bodies in space. Today, after more than a century of electric technology, we have extended our central nervous system itself in a global embrace, abolishing both space and time as far as our planet is concerned. Rapidly, we approach the final phase of the extensions of man, the technological simulation of consciousness, when the creative process of knowing will be collectively and corporately extended to the whole of human society, much as we have created already extended our senses and our nerves by the various media. So that the technological medium itself is a form of consciousness that's exterior to our bodies that we participate in, and it becomes, like this Teilhardian God consciousness.
Exactly.
And I think, the more you look at this post-colonial, neo-Marxist, post-structuralist theory in juxtaposition with traditional Thomistic, scholastic philosophy, you understand the stakes. You understand that enmity that we were talking about at the beginning. Like, what is the war on ontology really directed against? And it's against this Thomistic, total philosophical system that reveals God and the incarnation of Christ being the thing that holds the whole body, the whole of civilization together. So St. Thomas Aquinas had this concept called the analogy of being. In Latin, it's called the analogia entis. Very complicated. I'm just barely grazing the surface of understanding it. But it's basically that, and this is the way that we talk about images, the icon, the sovereignty, how the sovereign is an image of God, and the icon kind of holds the system together in this analogous relationship in which the image is analogous to God's sovereignty. So that's how the forms hold meaning together through analogy. We can't say that God is good in a total sense. We can't know God's full essence, but the goodness of your brother or your father or your friend is analogous to God's goodness. So there's a correlation that doesn't fully embrace God's. So if you look at that in contrast with the Girardian's idea of mimesis, I think this makes a lot of sense. Doug bought me for my birthday this book by the Reformed theologian Karl Barth, who is very influential not only for sort of Gnostic versions of Christianity in the 20th century, but also for some of the Vatican II Council Fathers, particularly the Germans. And he had this concept, he called the analogy of being the source of the Antichrist. And, he's trying to do war against this idea of the church being the triumphant image of God in society, Augustine's city of God concept being fully inhabited within the church. So he posited, in contradiction to the analogy of being, his own concept called the analogia relationis, so the analogy of relation. So this internal dialectics, or he had his own crisis theology or dialectical theology that he presented. And it's that we come to know God through this self-referential Hegelian kind of process theology in which we're relating to ourselves within this sort of, like what Marshall McLuhan is talking about with the central nervous system. That's the extension of our being in this immanent frame. So
Right.
all over the place there, Doug. Sorry about that.
No, you got a lot of good stuff in there. And I forgot the word. Will and I use it all the time. It's central to our model, which is self-referentiality. So the idea is scrunching down the transcendent frame so that we live basically in a reality right now through the spectacle where everything is self-referential. As Huxley predicted, they wanted to make this system. But yeah, what Will was talking about McLuhan, he wrote that in 1964, very similar to the Phenomenology of Man by Teilhard de Chardin, of its self-referential reality into perfect non-reality. And it's also ultimately pure simulacrum, which is actually, we can't get into it, but Baudrillard's stage 4, which is Marxist dream, where you get to self-referentiality to the point where there isn't going to be no professions, every man's a hunter and a fisher and all of this, but the state itself withers away into all we have is essentially a Teilhardian blob of love. It's as meaningless. It's a world without boundaries, right? The only problem with it is it's suggesting that there is no reality, ontological reality. So between man and a woman, X, Y, and Z, you get where I'm going. But they want to make it so your head is so full of jello that at least in your mind you think there are no distinctions in reality. So that's where they're taking the human mind on this roadshow, and it's very ultimately. It's Talmudic Kabbalah, and that's their vision of their final state from which they want to launch the Mashiach. All right, so we're going to transition a little bit from the spectacle and biopolitics. Let me end that idea with one more thing. An analogy throughout our book is Romans in the first chapter and the spectacle and where we're at right now. So it's a great analogy for the human condition. It's this idea that man knew God, knew him in his mind and his heart, but in becoming wise, he became a fool and traded in the image of God for the image of idols. And so that could be an analogy from Adam and Eve dropping all the way to the audience who were the Romans at that time. And certainly I think this is an analogy for the spectacle itself. It sneaks up on us and it owns us without us realizing it. And so I'd like to finish off that section just by having us think through the theological significance of the spectacle in that regard. The next topic is Neocons and Norwegians. So it's hard not to consume this kind of stuff. Most times I do it through secondary or tertiary sources. These days I will admit, I watch trad media more probably than anything. It's kind of the venue I'm in, and that's kind of who I'm pitching my book toward. So I like to see the lay of the land there. Neocons and Norwegians and the idea of the limited hangout. And so when I was first getting into this 9-10 years ago, I got right to developing the information that would go into Dr. Deep State beginning in 2017. And I was really fascinated by what are the characteristics. So I saw this early on. There's usually 3, 4, 5 bullet points of what a limited hangout is. And a couple times I've stopped making videos and people will, contact me. And I thought you weren't a limited hangout, meaning I stopped. And limited hangout, there's characteristics. You're saying the same year after year, the same. You can identify the same material year after year. And you're never addressing the enmity between the two seeds by name. And that's you gotta, at least from time to time, acknowledge the Norwegians, my people, because we're sneaky that way. So it just is. That's a reality. And you can write it off and just say the devil does this and the devil does that. There's truth to that. There is a pattern for how he works throughout Scripture and in the world. But when you fail to name it, that's you can trace that failing to name it with the decline of the mystical body of Christ, that is the visible church. And when that resistance began to wane, we see the rise of this new power of spectacle. So, and the neocons. Sometimes I'm just speechless. I just never know where to go with this, because you talk to some people and you trigger them with certain, because I was talking about this politics. It really has a strong psychological connection. The same way we're connected to sports teams, we get invested them, and it's hard to pull out. If you've been a lifelong fan of a team, it's hard to pull out. If that's how your brain processes politics, you're probably not even capable of pulling out. Although I've seen it happen. I've seen people maybe just jump ship over some things that are going on. But as we're getting into this, I mean, everything that, whatever nation state you're a part of right now, you have to sign on, take the pledge with the Norwegians, do the walk. And whether you're from the left or the right, you have to promote these policies, these neocon policies. And these are the people that their goal is to monopolize the world's resources for the arrival of the Mashiach. So it's not enough to have just insane amounts of riches. The goal is to, you will eat bugs. That's where they're going with this. You will eat bugs. You will own nothing. And so that it's part of their eschatology. It's part of where they're going. It's part of triggering the apocalypse. It's what they do. And people, I wrestled when I first got this question 10 years ago. I mean, are they making this happen, or is it by accident? And people ask that. And it's very much, they're at a war with reality. So how they get their power is through acknowledging the power of prophecy and inverting it, being versus non-being. It's a little heady. We won't go there right now, but yes, it's very deliberate. So as far as the political landscape. And I don't usually do this, but the talking points of the week and all that. Maybe we could go over the film, Caviezel, Trump, Kennedy, and I'll throw some of this at you. But the reason I talk about a limited hangout, when you consume this information, it's really important, because someone talks a good game, as Alex Jones once said, where's the turd in the punch bowl? So, and I want us to focus right now, especially when we get through this section, if there's any rad trads out there or conservative Catholics, I want them to kind of be very aware of the leaven coming into the traditional community. Gosh, as far as what's going on in the media world, in the world of the spectacle, because neoconservative social media is part of the spectacle. It really is. So what would be the first thing you'd like to hit, Will?
Yeah. There's a lot of concepts that you laid out there. I might want to just kind of tap on for a second before I wind up. I'll probably talk about Robert F. Kennedy first, because I think he's just, especially his messaging in the last couple weeks is just so schizophrenic and back and forth. And but anyway, yeah, you mentioned idolatry. In the book of Acts, verse 17:28 says that in him we live, we move, and we have our being. So this great chain of being, as we're talking about, and in pursuit of the metaverse, is the way in which our reality can have its existence only through God. Even though God is transcendent and outside of reality, we still are within his being in order to have our existence. So already the spectacle, the dialectical processing and self-referentiality of the spectacle, it exchanges the image of God as the source of being for our own becoming, our own self-image, our own inward gazing upon ourselves, and our own conflict resolution as being the source of historical progress, rather than we live, we move, and in him we have our being. A great way of identifying, the limited hangout is, they bump up against these big ideas, these big conspiracies, the source of enmity, but they leave out that one key component, as you mentioned, those pesky Norwegians. Gnosticism is a big, amorphous, easily appropriated term that often means very little, even though it's very significant for how this works. Also, Freemasonry, one of the terms that we're using in the book to describe Kabbalah is it's Gnosticism plus Messianism. It's Gnosticism with an eschatology attached of tikkun olam, of repairing the world and bringing in a messianic age and a grand cosmic revolution that undermines the present condition of reality. So it's at war with the God whom in we live, we move, and have our being. It has to undermine that kingship, and it has to undermine that foundation of reality in order to usher in this new age of existence, which is purely self-referential, technological, and geared toward this messianic ideal. So that said, they're going to roll out in front of us figures who appear as though they're on our side, that would say, well, I forget who was saying, something popped up on my news feed on YouTube or something this week where it says, like, we know that Trump is our good guy and he's a child of light, as Vigano has labeled him, because the globalists have such a vendetta against anything that he does, and they're always trying to lock him up and put him in jail and silence him, and you if you're glued into the spectacle, you just see these contradictions and conflicts as being purely organic, purely just these are independent actors who have their own ideas and they're just kind of working it out within this forum, rather than everyone's controlled. And in order to have a voice on that stage, you've already made some sort of allegiance, and you've already been rendered kosher in some way. So 1 week RFK Jr. is saying, there's research that I've seen that the COVID was weaponized to attack certain genetic lines and to leave others alone, such as I think the Chinese and the Norwegians or something like that. And then the next week, he's marching with the Chabad rabbi in New York City and claiming that he's the most pro-Israel candidate in the Democratic Party. And so it's this mixed messaging, which kind of keeps you on that limit, and you realize, and it's sort of impressed biopolitically into you, okay, this is the thing that can't be questioned. Even, our heroes, even the guys who are our martyrs and the sons of our martyrs, they're the ones who aren't even willing to step up to this ledge and ask it. But they're kind of pseudo asking it. They're presenting it and then unpresenting it. They're playing with that ground of being and non-being simultaneously around the question, so that it becomes sort of mystified and transcendent and almost messianic, in which you can name it, but you have to unname it simultaneously, so that it's not a part of the political landscape. It's sovereign and it's outside of the set that is able to be critiqued. So it's not willing to be the discourse of self-critique in politics is not able to be applied to that one category, which is the sovereign. So.
Yeah. Nice. Gosh, let's, I'm trying to think, is there any value talking about the right and the left at all? I think other than just to maybe do some discernment. Personally, my feeling is, you just always come back to the same point when you kind of see that both sides. It's like the prodigals of the Norwegians said, "We will give you your heroes. We will lock you into it. If they're on the world stage, one might be better than another, but what are you doing pushing that side? Because you're pushing it forward. You're pushing it forward if you're participating. But more dangerously, not only are you pushing this dialectic, your brain that participates, your soul goes with it. And, from a Christian perspective, you're here for a short time. There should be nothing more important to you than your eternal salvation. So that's the danger of participating in this, or looking, I know it's lame and it's repeated a lot, but looking for a political solution for a spiritual problem. But Kennedy, I do find it fascinating how he's written these books, and I understand they're very well done, and he really attacks Fauci and this kind of stuff. So that part of the discourse, and I'll even say this, sometimes as far as what gets out, I'll take controlled opposition over nothing at all. So I like the fact that he's got the lineage, he's got the respectability that is out there. And so I think that's great. As far as anything else he says, like his proposals about everything else, pro-green and believes the earth is warming. And I believe, unless he switched his position on that this week. So I think we got him down for now. I do welcome that voice and that perspective in the public arena. Let's flip it over and talk about the film. Caviezel.
Can I say one more thing real quick before we switch off of Kennedy?
Of course.
So this week he was in a Senate hearing, I guess, in which all the social media channels are just flooded with, at least the accounts that I follow, with statements from Kennedy about how he's being censored and how he's no one's allowing him to speak and everyone's misrepresenting his platform. And I think this is a great example of the medium as a message. He's there at a Senate hearing for what? He's not even a senator, or it's just they're giving him the platform under the auspices of him not having his platform being silenced, and we don't even question that. We don't even question how does this guy, something I've been saying, like Barack Obama very conspicuously was one of the only candidates who was allowed to vote against the invasion of the war in Iraq, in the lead up to his presidential campaign, to sort of set the groundwork for his legitimization. And so I think a similar thing could be at work here with RFK's positions on the scandemic and the remedy for that. And apparently he's very pro-vaccine. He's fully up to date on all his vaccinations. Even his flu shots, according to his recent Senate hearing. And it's like someone who's infamous / famous for having this position that's so outside of what's acceptable in the public forum, to then sort of totally invert that at the same time. It's playing with these limits of being and non-being, and I think that's how that dialectic is propelled forward and accelerated. But I'll hand it back over to you if you want to talk about the Sound of Freedom.
Yeah, I mean, before we get to that, we could just hop over to, I mean, if you want the epitome of this spectacle is, the artificial intelligence putting people in orange jumpsuits and the Coke in the White House, the laptop computer from hell. I mean, I think accidents do happen in those in the world, and those probably are. I don't know. But the hearing over there on the impeachment side again, and is it impeachment, impeaching an ex-president, which doesn't make much sense, before it's, so it looks political. It's all, I think it's certain elements are just so staged to suck you into this drama. And, the possibility of running a presidential election from prison. And I mean, it's just reality television gone bananas. But I didn't want to get there yet. So yeah, the film, well, I'll let you go, Will. You have more thoughts on this. I share your thoughts, but I'm going to let you go with it. What do you think?
I'm struggling with my unmute button here. Yeah, so I can't watch The Passion of the Christ without just weeping. That's one of our family traditions. Is during Holy Week we make it a point to watch The Passion of the Christ, and every time I'm such a sucker. I get wrapped up in it, and so it's hard to see this image of Jim Caviezel without associating him immediately to our Lord and Savior. And I think that's for a reason, and I think like these long plays, like I was just kind of saying with RFK Jr.'s, they're not outside the realm of possibility. I mean, there is a type of unfurling and mental confusion that takes place when you start saying, okay, everything's a conspiracy and all these people are puppets and all this stuff was rigged, 15, 20 years, 30 years in advance. Who knows? It starts to mess with your ideas of what's possible and what's real. But Caviezel, I think yesterday or the day before, they had a special showing of The Sound of Freedom with Donald Trump sitting in the front row. And then afterward, he went on Fox and Friends, Caviezel did, and said that, I'm still Jesus, but Trump is the new Moses, or he's Moses. And then, every week Trump is being awarded with new Norwegian accolades and crowns of the Moshiach, and how he's the appointed one to usher in the messianic age and to lead the people out of exile, and then you say, okay, well, what about the opposition? And then you've got Ron DeSantis. He's Noah Hyde laws now in Florida, no questions asked. We're locking you up if you even hesitate. So my feeling is this is such a shocking, horrifying, inhuman scourge to exist in our world, that if there are political authorities left, it should be their imminent responsibility to bring those involved to justice. Yet we can't even indict Ghislaine Maxwell. Why aren't they naming names? Why is Jim Caviezel and Tim Ballard, why do they have time to go on Fox and Friends and be the darlings of the right wing, and then they're not up there saying, hey, here's the network, here's the key, here's look down this road, ask these questions, investigate these people, and doing something that actually sticks and actually brings people to justice, rather than my innocent nieces and nephews who are 12-year-old now have to know about pedophilia and child trafficking, and that's like on the front page of the newspaper and on the mainstream media, and they have to think about that appetite, like what goes through someone's mind, and how does one wake up one morning and say, like, that's what I desire, that's the object of my desire. And then a child has to think through someone's psychology. It's so disorienting and destroys like the sense of sexuality and normal, sexuality is an act of procreation. It's like it's like what we said about piss Christ. It's like, this inversion of the inversion, this negation of negation. That's it's so devious that, like, how can you feel good about yourself, like making millions of dollars off of a film and then no one's arrested, and these children are liberated. Well, these things have to work through networks, and Donald Trump was president for 4 years, and we have to, if we're going to bring these people to justice, then Donald Trump has to be reelected to do what he did last time. I mean, he sure got the vaccine mandate and the shutdowns done pretty quickly without a lot of fuss. He had the authority to do that. So why doesn't he have the authority to, break up these networks of corruption and bring people to justice? If there's important people involved, then they can easily be brought down and publicly shamed. And, so that's my feeling about the film, is that it's more of this sort of crisis, state of exception, state of emergency theater that brings about very little change, except between the ears, except in the way people think about the world, people think about sexuality, think about power and responsibility and sovereignty, and what our politicians are actually put in place to do, and what we're willing to impeach them for, and what we're willing to ask them questions about. So I don't know if I was very precise there.
No, I like that. Good. Part about how this typology is so powerful, and the church doctors, the early apostles, the fathers, they realized typologically the end of the world, because I think they were spiritually endowed, because they founded the tradition that would found the Bible. And they saw this unfolding the way it is. And so it does work like birth pangs. It gets faster and faster, and the reveal gets faster and faster. And it should be a controlled reveal, because the spectacle, unlike what the Marxists like Negre and Hart say, that it's just an accident, we refute that and say no. Even Foucault hinted at that biopolitical systems have operators, and they steer this dialectic. So there's a controlled revelation going on. And I don't go deep into this stuff, but I noticed like Caviezel saying things like whoever's running things, the central bank, the Rothschilds. So compared to 5 years ago, getting somebody to drop names like that, it's like, wow, okay, so so that's out there, this idea. You can drop the names. Your brain has to go dead when you connect it to the Norwegians. Every dot, you connect it to the Norwegians. But it's biblical. That's who the enmity is against. And Will can talk about this beautifully. The chair of St. Peter, our Blessed Mother, was a Norwegian, right? Salvation comes through the Norwegians. So these are tricky things, and how we emotionally feel about it. What I'd like to talk about just briefly is the notion, a lot of people, Protestants, Catholics, they kind of do this holier than thou thing, or looking down on everybody like the conspiracy crowd. And to me, the reason I did this whole site is we all think that way. People on the left think, Hillary Clinton, it's a giant right-wing conspiracy. Protestants all think that Catholicism is a conspiracy. They can't locate it. It either happened, in the 3rd century or the 14th century. They can't locate it, but it's one huge conspiracy monopolizing the minds of Catholics. They can't cut through the paradox of the nature of reality. The nature of Christ is paradoxical, and the power that he left on the chair of Peter is paradoxical. Get behind me, Satan. And then I'm going to make you essentially the representative on earth, so that following the typology of the Old Testament, all power on earth is visible. It must be visible. And so it's still visible in that chair. People that just see the hordes of corruption and have to get out. And by the way, I watch Sedevakanis all the time. There's some brilliant people. I follow them. But that's the typology that I hold to for now. We'll get to that. But the chair can be two things at once. It's paradoxical. And that's what the medicacy is. It's staying in that tension, being confident and getting out, or having to delude yourself and stay in, but be confident. That tension of faith is paradoxical and it's difficult. But yeah, everybody's a conspiracy theorist of one kind or another. So to kind of, when people transcend that, and the reason I get into simple things that, if you look at a court of law, people conspire against each other. It's a reality. To sound like, to buy into the term that it means like unsolved mystery or Sasquatch or something like that. We all as humans see patterns, just like a lawyer sees patterns, just like a jury is asked to look at patterns. They exist. We think that way. But the problem in the world is the cognitive dissonance, the created void between being and non-being happens when you can bring all the patterns together, but you can't put your finger on the Norwegians. Okay. And so whatever angle you're coming from, non-conspiracy within it, that label literally is typological, and you cannot resist the restrainer. It comes on. That enmity has to be identified. And maybe we, at another video, can get into how we're linking ourselves to the work of Father Maudsley right now, one of the few voices that seems to get that. But yeah, so I think framing a pattern of reality, a pattern of this between right and blue, it's healthy for us to kind of see, the hand funding both political parties. The party, I'm a huge fan of Bishop Williamson. He's one of the few voices that can truly see these patterns together. If you ever watch some of his current interviews, there's just nobody out there that's saying this stuff. Yeah, about the film, you said it. I think the alignment, calling former President Trump, a Moses, or this kind of talk, I can't even bring myself to respond to that, frankly. Do you have anything more to say about the political landscape or these indictments against him, when you compare it to the laptop and the Coke in the White House? It's comical. It's reality television. It's the spectacle. And of course, it's not just consumed here. It's consumed worldwide. And people that consume it in other countries, you're going to be having a variation of that. But one thing for sure is the borders are being smashed throughout Europe, throughout America. We're all experiencing God-made nation states. And the integral structure of Catholicism, Christian civilization, respected those boundaries. That's what happened after the Tower of Babylon, trying to have one voice, one mind. God scattered the people and put them into their own language and their own borders. That's what's being dissolved right now with the coming New World Order. And they want us to hate our governments. They want us to think that the person in charge is Weekend at Bernie's and our choices are a Democrat that's telling more truth than anybody else and the clown show over here. And so what are your options? They're not very good. I mean, I wish I could tell you had some kind of options. They're not good. And people in every other democracy are faced with this situation. This democracy is a fraud. I think it can work to varying extents when you're out in rural America and government's far away anyway, and at a local level, you can have, your town council or so forth. It's not perfectly, but capitalism itself was a creation of these people. The Norwegians created it. Why? Free markets are beautiful. It's part of natural law. But when you talk about trading systems creating nations, it's necessarily becomes monopoly capitalism and controlled dialectics. But we're getting a little way. Do you have any final thoughts about any politics, Will?
No. I sent you this quote, or that this popped up on my feed, and it's I don't know the source, but it's in regard to Cardinal John Henry Newman, who wrote a lot about eschatology, the papacy, and heresy and those kind of things. Do you mind if I read this real quick?
No problem. Take your time.
Okay. Newman concludes his comments on the last persecution, the persecution of the Antichrist, thus: it may not be a persecution of blood and death, but of craft and subtlety. not of miracles, but of natural wonders and marvels of human skill, human acquirements in the hands of the devil. Satan may adopt the more alarming weapons of deceit. He may seduce us in little things, move the church not all at once, but little by little from her true position. He has had much success in this tactic in the last centuries. He has moved every part of the church away from the truth of Christ, from the old faith upon which it was built. It is Satan's policy to split up and divide us, to dislodge us gradually from the rock of strength. When he has divided the whole of Christendom, the final persecution may come. When we are full of schism and heresy, what better time for the appearance of the Antichrist? When Christians have flung themselves into the arms of the world, Christ's enemy, when they depend for their protection on the world and have surrendered their independence, honor, and strength to its approval, then will the Antichrist burst upon them in fury. Then will the idolatrous nations open the floodgates of wickedness and overrun the church and the world. So looking to the spectacle, it's like, I think, waiting for the Nephilim to rise up out of the sea and for these unmistakable signs of, the gates of hell being opened up in the bottomless pit. There's these subtleties in which the church is being, through aggiornamento and through the synod and synodality, shifted from her position, and our attentions are moved away from the eternal truths of the church to these kind of augmented, situated, accompanied truths of the contemporary era. And when our ability to recognize reality from total artifice is so degraded that we're having these kind of conversations that we are. That may be what the book of the Apocalypse is gesturing at, as much as these imminent physical dragons and signs. So we have to be watchful, but we also have to be part of the restrainer. And I think exactly. like you've said many times before, quoting Eric Vogelin, is that second realities are hatched by omitting one part of reality. Being very, very close, but leaving out an essential piece that allows it to kind of fold in on itself and become something outside. So I think part of being a part of the restrainer, part of being the true church and not the anti-church, there's this very thin limit between the kenosis and auto-demolition of the church and being a part of the passion of the church that's being overwhelmed by its enemies. And we can't play both sides. We can't say, well, we need to accelerate the contradictions and allow the church to implode and die, and for the truths to just collapse with them so that we can get to the other side of this. Because what's waiting on the other side of this is the Antichrist. We have to be a part of restraining and holding back through clinging to the truths of the faith and holding them up. And that means, and I think this is something that our friend and colleague Theo Howard's pointed out to me. We have all these wonderful, amazing encyclicals written in the 19th century by popes about the danger of Freemasonry and the new philosophy on undermining the perennial truths of Christendom and the social values of Christendom. But what's left out of those are mentions to the Norwegian special people who are kind of steering the Freemasons and the banks and the usurers in this direction to undermine the church. And could it be that the pontiffs of that age were in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars, as our friend Theo has pointed out? Could it be that they were compromised, or they felt like they had to practice some realpolitik in order to make the church, to solidify it in that context? But when they chose to leave out that one critical piece, it allowed for it to advance that much more. So I think now, and we have to do, like you said, the paradox here is that salvation is from the Jews. Our Lord, Our Lady, they're of, that race, and we have to treat that as part of our sacred tradition and as something that we should not lord over them, as St. Paul has said. But also at the same time, St. Paul says they are the enemy of all mankind, insofar as they have rejected our Lord, and they are no longer, they've been cut out of Israel. They've become reprobate. So that's not a message of hate. That's not a message of contempt, except for the contempt that's against our Lord. So we have to approach with a sense of love and charity, but at the same time, not fall into the trap of becoming anti-Norwegian and angry and vehement and seeking a political solution in that way. But at the same time, we have to be willing to, with our words, and welcoming of persecution, welcoming of martyrdom, welcoming of sacrificing our book sales and our opportunities to be on, other trad shows and to have a voice in the forum. We have to be willing to sacrifice that and become no one and follow the Lord in his passion to the cross if we want to be a part of that restrainer. That's the remnant of the church.
Yeah, a lot there. Good job, Will. I finish up in the words, whatever happens in the world and the state of the world, the advice given by Father Dennis Fahey at all times, without compromise, to defend the mystical body of Christ. And what that means is maintaining the enmity that's been there from the beginning of redemption history. I see a pattern since the inception of rabbinic Norwegianism. All groups think they can yoke themselves with it and get the upper hand, and nobody ever does. I've seen it over the Spanish, the English, the Arabs, just over and over. The modern day neocons are just the Republicans, that think or Democrats. There's no difference. Everybody takes an oath of allegiance. That think you can yoke yourself with this and still be true to Christ. I know this is a very uncompromising message, but you can't. It's biblical. You can't yoke yourself with people that reject that Christ is the Messiah. There can't be both being and non-being. Both things can't. I'll let you pick up on this lingo, but that's the contradiction. That's the statement of non-contradiction. Christ can't be the exclusive path to salvation, but yet there can also be a second covenant. The church replaced Israel. Catholics are the true Jews, the completed Jews. Doesn't sound politically correct. Not a lot of people are going to say that. But once you're afraid to say that, you're slipping and sliding to the point that next thing you know, the legislation's coming. We can talk about, who's crapping in whoever's bathroom or, exploited kids. But when Christ becomes hate speech, it's down the pike. One move at a time, one compromise at a time. And so if the traditional community is supposed to be about preserving it, but they're all delicate and they're too highfalutin to talk about conspiracies, or don't go on that route because it's going to mess up your mind. Look, that's how the church preserved the faith for 1900 years. And then they became afraid to talk about it. And so somebody that's out there cherry picking a pope that talks about stone cutters and masonry. No, pope after pope after pope talked about the Norwegians, and they had to. And Fahey was the last one, mid-century, and then after that they went soft. And that's the restrainer. It's cosmic. And that's what I wrote about as a Protestant and seeing through the singularity. You have to be able to identify it, otherwise you're compromising, as Fahey would say. You're compromising, and you have to support the mystical body of Christ. To truly love the church, you have to love it without compromise. And that's kind of my 2 cents. But yeah, the leaven in the church sneaking on in here. We might have to start naming names. Well, what do you think?